This video is a composite of interviews with workplace anthropologists, many of whom are in companies and organizations. Others work as consultants with those organizations. All of them have in common the mandate to effect change in the organizations and help the organizations effect change in the world. All of these organizations in that work pose some ethical and practical dilemmas, which these interviewees discuss.
Generally, people take positions in leadership of a union when they have earned their rage. When something has happened to them that they can no longer play in the system and they need to or want to use the other path. And that is the case with me. It's the case with most of the people I worked with. Let me take a step back and talk about applied anthropology and ethics in a broader sense on many of the jobs that I have had. When I started working for the Park Service in 1991, I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When I served on the grand jury, I took an oath to fairly and impartially evaluate the evidence provided to me and to keep the proceedings of those to keep the content of those proceedings secret. When I became the union president, I took an oath to defend bargaining unit members up to the full extent of the law. And in my current job, I often take an oath when we're involved in settlement discussions that anything that goes on in the room is secret and cannot be divulged to any party. So within that context, I sort of view anthropological ethics as defined by the AAA or the SFAA as interesting, but of secondary importance to the oath that I personally have taken. You know, there's no oath when you join the AAA or the SFAA, but there is when you take these jobs. And if you do not fulfill your oath, you can be terminated, fined, or thrown in jail, which are pretty severe penalties. So when I look at ethics, my primary focus is on government ethics, which could sound like an oxymoron, but actually is a pretty elaborated body of federal law and regulation. That's where I go to first. And we often talk in anthropology about doing no harm kinds of model. Part of what these jobs is doing harm. You know, is defending your person to the full extent possible, up to and including getting the other side fired. I do not view that as unethical, personally. It might be considered so within the anthropological discipline, but that's just too bad. Whack at the ethics guidelines, I think more applied people need to weigh in on this one, because many of the arguments that go on about the ethics code just make me laugh. One of the things you talked about is working with management in the context of being a union official. There's a tension in some federal unions. The union president or some of the senior people are on 100% union time position, which is really unusual. Typically, and the way I worked is that you essentially keep your current job and the union stuff is on top, and you can charge some of your time to union time, but you've still got to meet the demands of your regular job as well. And that can create a natural tension, and it sure did with me. And I think the point of the story is that serving in a union capacity and having to also maintain a cordial relationship with your immediate day job supervisor can be a stressful situation and is fraught with potential dangers.
some of the practical problems have been actually being able to spend time with people, because this kind of our process, kind of understanding our internal processes and how we work on projects was kind of something we had to do on the side. We couldn't stop the other work that we were doing to do this, so carving out the time was difficult, and then not and then the perception that when you went to go talk to people or try to ask kind of these kinds of questions, that you're seen as kind of this auditor, right? So you're there to get people in trouble or expose how ineffective or inefficient they are, which is not wasn't the point, but oftentimes that's how it can be perceived. Um, and then the kind of other kind of ethical issues of you know is this information, who we're sharing the information that we're gathering with, or who we're not sharing it with, and those things like that. Addressing those issues was important as well. Since I was new in the company, I was still able to ask some of those kinds of really basic kind of, hey, I'm new around here, kind of outsider kind of questions, right? But it seems like in addition to having the time to carve out, it's being able to learn how to actually kind of do this job that you're supposed to be doing. At the same time, you're trying to question, like, well, should we be doing this a different way? So there is this kind of tension about needing to do things the day to day, but then trying to both understand how all this stuff works. At the same time, you're trying to say, why are we doing it this way to begin with, and how could we be doing this better? So I mean, that's kind of like an unresolved tension, but it still was something that I had to kind of work through.
Another thing that's, well, it's partly related with ethics, maybe, is that after the first couple of weeks that I was working there, I was asked. I got to hear a rumor which was was addressing the issue, which is not so uncommon in this type of research, as you probably have certainly noted, that that I would be a spy, because I might be rather further correlated in relationship to the owner. I might be their niece or whatever. So this was kind of a rumor that grew, and once I got hold of it, I used the next possibility to talk to the guy who told me about that, and I said, that's an interesting one, and I understand your point, and I would be cautious about that as well. But as I mentioned before, I was not acquainted to the whole company before that at all, and so I had a couple of interactions with the owner and the top management, and the other guys could actually see that, and they realized very quickly that this was not a family relationship at all, because it was way too formal for that. And so very soon this whole issue was
I think a common ethical issue is saying you're going to keep someone's confidentiality and yet still having to use the information to illustrate what a problem is and why it's important. And here's an example from this HR project about attracting and retaining talent. An employee told us a story about how he felt that his boss didn't have his back. His wife gave birth to a child. The child had to go to the intensive care unit. And even though his boss said you could have a couple of days off, he was still getting work requests. And while he was in the intensive care unit trying to be with his family, he's getting these work requests. He has to ask a nurse to let him out of the room and onto the roof where he can get a Wi-Fi signal. And the experience traumatized him and made him feel that, even though his boss said you could have some time off, it really wasn't covered. So the story was so poignant, and we really needed to tell it to the client, but yet we had to strip out some of the identifying details because people in this organization would recognize who this was. So trying to collect these meaningful stories that have a huge impact and yet protect confidentiality is always an issue, and trying to figure out ways to do that takes a little bit of time and effort as well, but you absolutely have to guarantee someone confidentiality if you promise it to them.
You asked about ethical issues. I had a good fortune to have an academic advisor, Robert Rubenstein, at Syracuse University in my graduate program, who had thought a lot about the ethical issues in applied anthropology and passed some of that knowledge and questions along. Then, because I was involved in the AAA Commission looking into the ethics of working with national security, I was exposed to a lot of different perspectives and arguments on all sides. So I came in with maybe a little bit more facility with ethical decision making and maybe a little bit more vigilance than a lot of anthropologists hitting this kind of situation would have. But there are a couple of things that I did and others could do. The first one was that I made a decision right up front that I would not involve myself in culture-specific or regional analysis. I felt my role needed to be either providing general concepts and skills to help Marines make better decisions, or working on the organization itself. I felt like helping them understand a particular group of people was ethically more problematic than doing what you would do in any intro class, which is to help people learn how to figure those things out for themselves. I don't think that anybody is necessarily going to have to make that same decision, but the important thing is that you think through the work context as you learn about it, and you set lines that you're not going to cross, and you prepare yourself for what you will do if somebody tries to push you over that line, even if that means that you have to leave the job. Certainly over the last several years, most of the ethical issues that we've faced have been less somebody trying to tell us what to do and more about the broader implications of taking on a particular research project or the particular approach that we might choose to execute a research project. Also, there is some choosing that I have to do in terms of, we are a limited group of people with limited number of hours in the day, and so we sometimes have to choose whether to do project X or project Y, and in this context, sometimes both projects have equal merits and will have equal impact on the lives of Marines and others, and we just have to make a choice about how we're going to prioritize one over the other. On a broader ethical note, one of the things that was unusual that came up very shortly after I started working with the Marine Corps was an effort for the Marine Corps to stand up its own institutional review board so that it wasn't having to deal with the Navy's IRB, which is primarily biomedical. We were able to successfully work with them to understand the special ethical challenges related to ethnographic research and the kind of mixed method, semi-structured, multi-context research we do. So it's much more possible to do that kind of work now within the Marine Corps because of that upfront work we were able to do with the IRB. That's not so much a dilemma, but it was an ethical issue I certainly hadn't expected when I showed up. I had assumed there would already be a fully functional IRB in place. I didn't expect to be involved in helping stand it up.
Fortunately, my government boss, like I said, Dr. Carrie Fosher, she is excellent at providing us top cover on that. She, like I said, she's an anthropologist involved with the AAA, all that. She will not let us get involved in something that could be kind of ethically sticky. Also, we have individual researcher agreements that say that we can recuse ourselves of anything that could violate our professional code of ethics. And so she's done a whole lot kind of in making sure that we don't get stuck with that sort of thing. Otherwise, I really can't think of anything that has been troublesome in that way. The thing that we do is we have a very, very, we hug our IRB as close as we can. The Marine Corps University IRB, we work very closely with them. We make sure to follow every little bit of the protocol. And, we're very stringent about that. And that helps us, get around a bunch of, potential ethical bumps. Sometimes if we have research coming down, a request for research coming down from higher up, which doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes, some general realizes that, oh, we have the social science research capability. Let's try this toy out. We're able to, if they want us to, investigate specific things, but say if somebody reveals potentially illegal activity, we have to report that. We're like, no, that is not something we do. And we're able to kind of stand behind the IRB bit there talking about, this is human subjects research. we protect our sources. Like you cannot do that. And once again, that's where she and a couple of other social scientists that we work with, PhDs in other Marine Corps organizations, they're pretty good at navigating those and convincing people why we can't do those things that might be considered, kind of ethically sticky.
I believe ethics are very important, and I believe it's extremely helpful to have guidelines and to kind of know what you should do or what you might consider doing under certain circumstances. Guidelines and discussions with colleagues at that moment. There's a number of ways that you might proceed. But I also think that the amount of attention that anthropologists give to ethics is overblown. I wrote a paper with Tracy Meerwarth that first came out in the Journal of Business Anthropology and now has been updated in a book chapter in a book that just came out this year by Tim Malafite and Bob Moraes. And in that, we argued that there were huge problems with the AAA ethics statement because it emphasized the importance of adhering to these principles that they set forth without regard to any other sets of principles. So, for example, if you work for an organization, there was no recognition, or there is no recognition in the current AAA ethics statement that there's value in having to turn to multiple ethical guidelines in the course of trying to figure out what to do in an ethical situation. And so in our case, we walked the reader through 4 different cases where we had to kind of bounce back and forth between the GM code of ethics and the AAA ethics statement. And we were able to show, I think, that you have to consider both. And then you also have your own personal ethics. What would you do under certain circumstances? And does this sound like it's the appropriate action to take? So that was one big problem we had with it. And another problem that we outlined is that there was this excessive emphasis on research in the AAA ethics statement. Well, it turns out that a lot of practitioners don't do research. I happen to be one of the ones who do, but there are many others who don't. They're project managers, they're analysts, they're intercultural trainers, they're administrators. I mean, they do things that don't necessarily involve research, and so there's no recognition that those kinds of people actually fit under the AAA ethics statement. And then the third big problem with it is that there's this extraordinary amount of emphasis on doing no harm, but nowhere in that ethics statement does it talk about the value of helping organizations or communities change the way they would like to change.
I know that people probably want to hear about successes where we did a piece of research and the institution changed as a result, and we have had some of those, but I want to really focus on the macro level goal of helping the organization better integrate scientists and scientific knowledge. And 2 of the successes that we've had there have to do with making things public and endurance. On the making things public front, that has meant writing protocols, contracts, and creating policy documents to support us in making as much of the group's work public as is humanly possible. And that helps us transfer knowledge out to the discipline that would be otherwise very difficult for anthropologists and other social scientists to access, and hopefully broadens the ability of the scientific community to do work on the military as well as increasing the level of nuance that people have when they think about the military, rather than just thinking about it as the Pentagon, as though that was an actual agency-bearing entity rather than a building. The other aspect of success has to do with endurance, and I think this is really important for young anthropologists to know when they're going into a workplace. If you're planning to be there for a while and you really are invested in trying to help one organization or a cluster of organizations over a period of years, never throw anything away. Never. This week I was able to answer a question for a very senior leader within 5 minutes because of something I had done 5 years ago and that had been dismissed at the time by somebody else. I was able to go into my hard drive, pull it out, send it along, and it helped answer the question in a way that would have otherwise taken us several weeks or several months to get to. Likewise, we had a resilience project that went on for several years, and the lead researcher for it did get very frustrated that the ideas were not being adopted right away. But today I got a call from one of the major components of the Marine Corps who had looked at his work, and they're trying to figure out how to incorporate it. You have to be willing to have some staying power in order to see those kinds of successes because the bureaucracy moves so slowly. But you also have to be organized and keep records and be able to jump on opportunities as soon as.
The value of bringing people along and having a sense of ownership in the research and really getting to the human side of things is tremendous. I've had clients who were in tears when we presented research findings to them. We often find that more when we're doing government work or nonprofit work, but I think when you can really create that empathy and create that connection, I think that's where the biggest success is. And then for me, also success is opening up new opportunities for other researchers, particularly ethnographic research, or, sometimes we call it contextual inquiry. So, it's still sort of a structured interview, but taking people into the field, into people's homes or into people's workplace. A lot of junior researchers haven't really had that kind of an experience. And I think, everyone walks away from it transformed in some way.